Hello, everybody. Let's talk about this new feature that is coming up in Zurich release. It's known as Cluster License Assignment Preference Management. So, before understanding this feature, let's understand the problem statement of why we are developing this feature. So, the problem statement is that SAM managers are looking for a configurable mechanism to license the softwares that are deployed on clusters as per the organization's licensing strategy. Now, we know that currently SAM managers use allocations to achieve that licensing strategy, but we know that allocation is not a very robust solution. It's not efficient and it's prone to errors. For example, if you allocate to the virtual layer for a cluster and the number of virtual machines grow in the future, then you have to keep adding those VMs for the allocation to happen, which is prone to errors. So, therefore, the SAM managers want a more configurable mechanism to follow the licensing strategy. They use allocations and they do not prefer that because that's manual in nature. And they sometimes don't want to follow the optimization strategy by SAMPro because they do have their own licensing strategy in place. So these were the main problem statements which led us believe to develop the solution, which is known as cluster license assignment. Now, some examples where SAM managers are looking for configuration. So one of the main example is that a cluster having a high number of virtual machines running Microsoft Windows Server standard installs. Now, the number of standard installs are high, and SAM Pro has performed an optimization and it has licensed the cluster at the host layer using Windows Server data center licenses, as this approach is more cost effective. However, the SAM manager prefer to utilize the Windows Server standard licenses at the VM layer. So in this case, they would have to go ahead and do allocation, which is very non-efficient and prone to errors. Similarly, a cluster having high number of VMs running Microsoft SQL Server Standard. Now in this, SAMPro has licensed the cluster at the virtual layer using Microsoft SQL Server Enterprise layer because it is cheaper. However, the SAM manager wants to license the host with SQL Server Enterprise licenses, anticipating future growth in the number of VMs. Because this approach is seen as more robust, they would have more VMs on the cluster and they prefer to license at the host layer because they do not want to keep licensing at the VM layer, which is uh, not very efficient for them. So they want to have control over that strategy. So that's what the feature does. It gives more control to the SAM manager to license the software deployed on the cluster as per their organization licensing strategy. What is the outcomes? Outcome is that there's a more configurable mechanism for SAM manager to add the cluster licensing preference. This is a very easy, intuitive, and robust mechanism to license the cluster without worrying about what would happen in the future as the number of VMs grow or the number of softwares grow. And of course, you have to have a strategy, but that strategy has to be in the purview of the licensing rules of the publisher, like Microsoft. For example, you cannot say that I want to license the VM for SQL Server Standard, um, using SQL Server Enterprise or things like that. So, those validations are important, and those validations are built into the solution. So this is a one-stop shop for SAM Manager to add the cluster license preference. Now, what is the journey of the SAM Manager as they're using this feature? So the step one is that they could go to SAM Cluster 360. This feature integrates with SAM Cluster 360 seamlessly. So you could just see the cluster infrastructure and check where the current license consumption is happening. Now you come to the cluster licensing assignment again on the license operations, and you determine where you would want to license the cluster. You just make that configuration change. Now, as soon as you make the configuration changes, SAMPro would run some validations for you. For example, if you do not have active software assurance, you cannot license at the VM layer. and things like that. So it would perform some validations automatically so that your strategy is compliant with the licensing rules of the publisher. Then you run recon and you determine the license compliance and consumption, which is in accordance with your licensing strategy. And then on the core optimization report, which is an existing report, you determine why this cluster was licensed the way it is. In this case, we'll show you some notes which will tell you that, hey, this cluster was licensed using the cluster license assignment strategy that was followed by the organization. Now, this may not be uh, in um, in accordance with the license optimization performed by SAMPRO. So, we would give you those differences so that you could understand why SAMPRO licensed the cluster in such a way. So that is all about the cluster license assignment journey. Now let's look at a use case for demo purposes. So in this use case, we have got a cluster A, and it consists of about 30 virtual machines which runs SQL Server Standard. And SAMPRO has licensed using SQL Server Standard licenses at the virtual layer because the customer has got software assurance and it is more cost efficient in that way. Now, the organization SAM manager have got a different licensing strategy. They want to license this cluster A with SQL Server Enterprise at the host layer or the physical layer. And the reasoning behind it is that in the future, the organization anticipates that the cluster A will have more number of virtual machines and the virtual machines will grow. And they prefer that if they license at the host layer, they do not have to worry too much and keep licensing at the host, which is more robust and scalable in their opinion. So we want to support those use cases. So before that, let's look at what happened, right? So cluster A, as you can see, which is this cluster, has got SQL Server Standard running. It has about 30 virtual machines and 5 hosts. And you can see that it is cost effective to license the VMs using SQL Server Standard at the VM layer because it offers license mobility rights. So ServiceNow has automatically applied the license, um, and you can see here that the licensing was applied at the virtual layer, which is more cost effective. Now the SAM manager wants to change this. So let's see what are the steps the SAM manager needs to perform. So with that, I'll move to the demo. So I'm into license operations. I've got this cluster view, which shows me the list of clusters in my environment. And as I want to look at cluster A, first of all, I want to understand what is the infrastructure of cluster and how it is licensed. So I can just open cluster 360. It shows me that this cluster has about 5 hosts, we just saw, about 30 VMs, and about all the VMs has got SQL Server Standard installs running. And if I want to look at the software models consuming, I see that it has been licensed with SQL Server 2019 standard license. And I can just look at the optimization just to be sure. So I can see that uh, this cluster was licensed using SQL Server 2019 standard licenses with software assurance, and the current license consumption layer is virtual in nature. So that kind of proves that this license was optimized for SQL Server Standard. Now, if I want to check more, I can go to the license required by section on the license workbench, open up SQL Server 2019 Standard, and just check the licenses. And I can see that cluster A has been licensed only at the virtual layer. You can see that, right? So now I want to change because my strategy is to license this cluster, which is cluster A, at the host layer using SQL Server Enterprise. Now, how can I do that? I can just go to license operation, open up the cluster license assignment, and create a new record for cluster A. So I can just choose cluster A here. I can choose the licensing layer, which is physical or host layer. I can choose the product, which is SQL Server. I can choose the version if I want to. I want to leave it blank because all the versions can be covered by this edition. And I can say that I want to license the host with enterprise license, and I can choose license metric, which is per core in this case. And that's about it. Now, if I choose something else like Perco with Cal, or use SQL Server at the virtual layer for standard, and if I do not have software assurance and things like that, the system will throw some errors. But let's save it. So no errors here, and the validation has been successful, it seems. So you can see here now that the record has been created for cluster A. So let me refresh it. You can see the record has been created for cluster A, which shows that the licensing layer is physical and enterprise layer. So I want to license this cluster A using SQL Server enterprise license at the physical layer. Now that's about it. Now I just need to run reconciliation. So let me do that. I'll choose it for Microsoft, and it will take some time, but all right. So the recon is completed. So I can move back. I can open again for Microsoft, and let me just open it for 2019 Enterprise because I wanted cluster A to be licensed by Enterprise at the host layer. So we can see that some consumption has happened here. I can open it up, and now I can see that cluster A has been licensed at the host layer because is virtual is false. And more details about it, you can see it here. So that is all about this feature. Now, if you want to understand the reasoning behind it, you can open up the core optimization report from the optimization section and check the reasoning why SAMPRO licensed um, SQL Server, uh, licensed cluster A with SQL Server Enterprise at the host layer. It will just tell you that that was because of the cluster license preference that was set up. So thanks all for looking at this demonstration. Please let me know if there's any questions. Thank you.